because the crisis was not simply caused by, mistakes on balance sheets. It was created by, factors of how Sri Lanka governs itself. We want Sri Lanka to get a deal with the IMF so that funding can come, but more importantly than that, so that the reform program that is being discussed between the Sri Lankan government and the IMF.
There are attempts to discourage the IMF to reach this agreement with Sri Lanka based on Sri Lanka's human rights record.
We have no interest, I have no interest in interfering in Sri Lankan politics, which is a matter for the Sri Lankan people and their democratically elected political leaders.
Hello and welcome to another episode of On Fire here on Daily Mirror. I'm Easwaran Rutnam. Sri Lanka's international relations is more important than ever, I guess, these days, with the country facing a serious economic crisis and international support much required. One country that Sri Lanka can, I guess, look forward to or look to is New Zealand. And with me on the program today is the High Commissioner for New Zealand in Sri Lanka, Michael Appleton. Welcome to the program, High Commissioner.
Thanks very much for having me.
So, High Commissioner, how would you see the relations at the moment between Sri Lanka and New Zealand?
I think we have very warm, very friendly and very growing relations. Our two countries in 2016, actually, when President Wickremesinghe was in New Zealand as Prime Minister, our two countries announced back then that we were going to open High Commissions in each other's countries, and that was a reflection of the fact that while for decades we'd had very warm and substantive relations, we wanted to invest more in the relationship and try and get more out of it, and we, New Zealand, about 18 months ago, made good on that promise, have opened our High Commission here, and a really big focus of that is to try and find ways in which our two countries can cooperate, which create value both for Sri Lankans and for New Zealanders.
So since establishing the High Commission in Sri Lanka, have you seen a growth in the relationship, trade relationship?
Well, I suppose one thing that has changed that none of us anticipated 18 months ago was that Sri Lanka has faced this very severe economic crisis and the related social and political events that surrounded that, and I think that sort of has changed the context of what we're doing, and I think one of our primary focuses in the High Commission was supposed to be to build and to diversify the economic relationship between our two countries. For decades it's been dominated by New Zealand sending milk powder to Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka sending tea and rubber to New Zealand, and we very much want to diversify that economic, that trading relationship. The economic crisis has, to be honest, made that more challenging because many New Zealand companies who might be considering coming here, operating here, investing here, they've seen these images and these stories of a country in crisis, and so part of our job is to try, as Sri Lanka moves along this path, hopefully from crisis to recovery, that we can start to try to improve that image and try to encourage New Zealand companies to look at Sri Lanka anew, and to see this process of moving towards recovery as an opportunity to try to enter the Sri Lanka market and to make the most of that. And I think there are a broad range of areas where that could happen. I think a very obvious area is in the primary industries. So New Zealand makes a lot of money from making food and beverage products from our land, and we sell them all around the world. That's one of the primary ways in which New Zealand makes money. New Zealand has only really sold milk powder in large quantities to Sri Lanka, and there are many other products we could be selling. I mean, I think in another area is education. Our universities are building connections with one another to try and help Sri Lankans go in greater numbers to New Zealand as students, and those education connections, I think, can build value for both countries as well. So there are various opportunities, but we have to acknowledge, the reality of the crisis and the challenges that presents us.
There have been concerns, I think, among some countries that these these trade balances have not really favored, others. It has been favoring more towards Sri Lanka. Do you see that as well with the?
Well, in our case, the trade flows have actually been in New Zealand's favour because the quantities of milk powder that we sell to Sri Lanka are so vast, and they outweigh the tea and rubber and other products that Sri Lanka sends to New Zealand. But I think it would be a good thing if the trade profile in both directions was diversified, and we worked out companies that wanted to operate in each other's countries. I mean, I think in the other direction that I meet Sri Lankan IT professionals all the time who think that there are IT services that could be sold into the New Zealand market, which would be beneficial and create value for New Zealanders. So that's an area. So we're always looking for opportunities. Realistic about the crisis situation, but really trying to help contribute to this the effort of the Sri Lankan people and the Sri Lankan institutions and the Sri Lankan government to recover from this crisis.
So there have been concerns about the political stability in Sri Lanka. Some governments, some investors have also raised concerns whether they can actually put their money in a country which is unstable. I mean, how do you see the situation now? Do you think that there is some sort of stability setting in?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's for me to comment on the current political situation. I think it is absolutely fair to say that in a situation of economic crisis, if there is sort of constant churn at the political level, cabinets resigning all the time, those kinds of things, that does contribute to a sense that this is a country that's not able to govern itself, and that is not a safe place for investment. And I think that that's quite important to recognise in terms of how Sri Lanka recovers from this economic crisis, is that I think the IMF has made this clear too, is that it's not just economic policies that need to be considered and reformed, it's the way that Sri Lanka is governed, because the crisis was not simply caused by mistakes on balance sheets. It was created by factors of how Sri Lanka governs itself. And so reforms with respect to good governance, but also the business environment, how easy it is to do business, transparency, combating corruption so that external investors can trust that where their money is going is where it's meant to go. Those kinds of things are very important. And so, of course, as the international community looks at, and New Zealand looks at how Sri Lanka is recovering from the crisis, it's not just going to be a question of the balance sheet of the Sri Lankan government, which obviously is a very important and foundational part of Sri Lanka recovering from the crisis, but also at all of these other factors. Do
you see improvements in some of these factors for New Zealand investors to put their money in Sri Lanka?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think a situation where there aren't rolling political developments which are causing instability, but at the same time, as I sort of come back to what I was saying, is that in judging whether Sri Lanka is able to rebound from the situation and not find itself in a similar situation in future, it requires both economic reforms and governance reforms. And so, I think the Sri Lankan government, since the president has taken over, has announced a range of reforms across a range of these areas, and how it will be judged, including in the IMF context, will be about implementation. You can talk about a range of things, but what actually happens, what happens on the economic reform front, what happens on the governance reform front. And this isn't at all about lecturing. New Zealand has been through economic crises which have been caused by mistakes in economic policy and mistakes in our governance system, and we've strived to reform them and overcome the crisis. And one of the things that we want to be doing with the Sri Lankan government is identifying areas where they're looking to reform, where we have done that in the past, and provide some expertise to help them. So one very small niche area example of that is that the Sri Lankan government currently, with its reform of its monetary policy and its desire for its central bank to be more independent, these are things that New Zealand has done in the past, and we've brought a former acting governor of our Reserve Bank here to help the central bank governor work on those reforms. So that's one small example, but it's just sort of an indication of our intent that where the Sri Lankan government or other institutions are working on things to help get Sri Lanka out of this crisis, we have some expertise where we can help, then we're very happy to help.
You mentioned about the IMF. Is there a role that New Zealand can do to encourage or to persuade the IMF to reach this, agreement that we're all looking forward to?
Yeah, I mean, I think there will be a decision at some point by the IMF board, and I think New Zealand has a role in that, in the sense that we're a stakeholder, and so we contribute to that decision making. And so yes, we absolutely have a role in that, and New Zealand government's representatives here, we have a role in sort of reporting back to our head office about what is happening here and giving an accurate picture of what are the areas where progress is being made, what are the areas where maybe progress is not being made. But with respect to the most challenging issue at the moment that the Sri Lankan government has identified that they're going through, these discussions with about debt sustainability and with their creditors, I mean, that very much is a question of the Sri Lankan government and their major creditors, which includes some very large and geopolitically important countries, them getting together and coming to an agreement about what's fair for everyone, what's equitable for everyone, and what is sustainable for Sri Lanka, because on a debt front, obviously, Sri Lanka got itself to a position which wasn't sustainable, hence the default, and now a rearrangement has to happen. And so we obviously, New Zealand really wants those discussions to succeed. We want Sri Lanka to get a deal with the IMF so that funding can come, but more importantly than that, so that the reform program that is being discussed between the Sri Lankan government and the IMF can proceed, and Sri Lanka can start to remove the causes of the economic crisis in the first place, which, as I've indicated, both economic and governance causes can be looked at. So I very much hope that deal can be reached expeditiously, but I guess ultimately the speed of that is outside of our hands. Yeah.
But how do you also, there have been again concerns about Sri Lanka's human rights record as well, and there are attempts to discourage the IMF to reach this agreement with Sri Lanka based on Sri Lanka's human rights record. How does New Zealand, I know you've had discussions with NGOs and civil rights activists in Sri Lanka as well. How do you see the human rights situation in Sri Lanka?
Well, on the human rights situation, I should say that through this crisis that I have, like a lot of my ambassadorial High Commissioner colleagues, have from time to time made public comment about the developments here, and that's primarily, we have no interest, I have no interest in interfering in Sri Lankan politics, which is a matter for the Sri Lankan people and their democratically elected political leaders. But what I do have an interest in is describing the universal principles that are important, that are universally important, and that Sri Lanka has signed up to internationally, so that they might be upheld as Sri Lanka goes through this crisis, because it can be rather straightforward to observe human rights in easy times when there's peace and there are no challenging issues going on. The real test of a country is, are human rights respected when the pressure really comes on, and undoubtedly in 2022 the pressure has really come on. So I have made statements publicly about the importance of freedom of speech, the importance of peaceful protest, the importance of restraint on the part of both protesters and the security services of the Sri Lankan government. And these are all principles that are really important to my government, and through the UN process and the Human Rights Council we have expressed those. There are obviously also legacy issues that relate to the civil war, accountability issues, reconciliation issues that are important to us as well, that we speak to. That's not, highlighting those issues is not the same as saying we don't think any support should go to the Sri Lankan people or the Sri Lankan government until Sri Lanka is perfect on all of those issues. That would be a very counterproductive position to take. So we've despite talking about these various human rights issues, that hasn't stopped us providing $1.5 million worth of support through UNICEF and the World Food Programme and the FAO for Sri Lankans who don't have enough to eat, or to Sri Lankan farmers who don't have inputs for their crop harvest. So it's possible to do both things at the same time, and I would just come back to on the IMF front, we very much want that to succeed. We also very much want the Sri Lankan government to make reforms on the both economic side and the governance side, because we believe very much in a transparent democratic system as part of Sri Lanka's path towards recovery, and we very much want to support Sri Lanka to uphold its human rights commitments. We want all of those things, but we are not going to. We want all of those things together, and we're not going to we're not going to hold one thing to ransom for one other thing. We're going to try and encourage progress across all of those things at the same time.
I'd also like to talk about the importance of the Sri Lankan diaspora. There is a fairly decent amount of Sri Lankans in New Zealand. How can they contribute? How are they, of course, contributing to New Zealand, and how can they, in return, also contribute to Sri Lanka?
Yeah, New Zealand has a large and very, very successful Sri Lankan diaspora. When I met with them before I came, one of the things that some of their representatives said to me was that they'd done the research based on our census and had found that Sri Lankans are the best educated of any, had the highest educational qualifications of any community in New Zealand, and that is borne out by my own experience, that the Sri Lankans you meet in New Zealand are extremely successful, and they are doing professions that are of huge benefit to New Zealand. They are doctors, they are lawyers, they are engineers, they are nurses. They are helping to run New Zealand as a country, as a government, as a society. That's hugely beneficial to us. The Sri Lankan community in New Zealand have been watching the crisis here this year extremely closely. They have been sending money themselves. They've been wanting to work out what is the best way that we can help in a financial sense. They've been pushing the New Zealand government to do as much as possible to help, and they're just very interested in knowing what is happening and how they can help. And I think that's probably true of Sri Lankans everywhere in the world, that they've watched their homeland, this beautiful island, going through these very difficult times, and they've wanted to know how to help. So we've definitely been working with them, with the Sri Lankan community in New Zealand, to just work through those issues. In terms of the future, I think one function of this crisis is lots of Sri Lankans, or the number of Sri Lankans wishing to leave Sri Lanka for other places has increased. I've personally experienced that. I am approached every day by Sri Lankans who wish to travel to New Zealand, whether as students or as skilled migrants or whatever it is, and we will obviously facilitate that to the extent possible. New Zealand is a small country. We can't obviously take everyone, but there is a good match, I think, between many of the Sri Lankans wanting to come to New Zealand, and we have a list of, a few dozen, we call it our green list, a few dozen professions where we don't have enough such people in New Zealand, and so we want to bring people from overseas. So there are those opportunities, but I think the other element of that, obviously, and this is built into the education links that we have, is that we want that exchange to be beneficial to Sri Lanka as well. And so I'm very much hoping on the education side, for example, that the students that come and get a higher education in New Zealand through our university system come back and contribute to Sri Lanka, because as Sri Lanka rebuilds, Sri Lanka is going to need its best and brightest here, not everyone overseas. So that's an issue we're conscious of as well.
Are you seeing an increase? We've heard this from Australia though, but are you seeing an increase, or an attempt at least, to reach New Zealand illegally through illegal migration? Is there a...
Yeah, we're very worried about illegal migration from Sri Lanka, or at least I should say we are very concerned about criminal organisations based in Sri Lanka who wish to prey on vulnerable people who are desperate because of the economic crisis and sell them a pipe dream of getting to New Zealand, which, given the vessels that they use to put these people in, is almost certainly not going to happen, but these people are going to have their lives put at risk. We had 300 some Sri Lankans who were found off the coast of Vietnam recently, and looking at the pictures of those vessels that they were in, you know, these people could have died. They didn't die because some people some people were able to rescue them. But these criminal organisations are essentially sending people offshore to die so they can make money. That's obscene, and we are very concerned about it because one of the countries they are selling to these vulnerable Sri Lankans is New Zealand. So, Australia has historically been a target for this, but Australia has been very effective, I think, in making clear that nobody will be accepted in Australia. New Zealand has been used as sort of an alternative destination, and we wish to make very clear that we want nothing to do with this, and we think this is an obscene thing to happen. And so we have a focus on, one of the members of my High Commission is very focused on this issue. He works from our police force, and his job is to work with Sri Lankan authorities and other partner countries to help detect and interdict these operations before they launch. So yeah, it's something we're very worried about, and we want to do our bit to stopping, but not mostly from a perspective of we don't want boats coming to New Zealand because it would be very difficult for them to make it. It's a long way. Logistically, physically, it would be very hard to do, but mostly from the perspective of we do not want vulnerable Sri Lankans sent possibly to their death at sea because they're being told they can come to New Zealand by these criminal organisations. So we're determined to do what we can to try and stop that from happening.
What are the areas that you see as far as trade is concerned where Sri Lanka and New Zealand can probably expand more or improve more going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I've mentioned some of these. I mean, I think in the Sri Lanka to New Zealand direction, that IT services are very obvious. We've seen increasingly that Indian firms are selling IT services into New Zealand. I know very high quality IT companies exist here. I've spoken to many of them. They're very keen about the New Zealand market. I see that as an area of growth. I think education services is another obvious area that there are these increasing agreements between our universities where you can do sort of half your degree in Sri Lanka and then complete it in New Zealand. Those kinds of arrangements can be beneficial on an economic point of view for both the Sri Lankan institution that's doing it and the New Zealand institution, and that's leaving apart obviously the educational and people-to-people benefit from such arrangements. So I think those are two obvious areas. Tourism is another one. I mean, I think that again, as Sri Lanka rebounds from the crisis, we're already starting to see a rebound of the tourism inflows. That New Zealand could and should be a source of. New Zealanders have been shut in New Zealand for 2 summers because of COVID. We had very stringent border closure rules, and there is a lot of pent-up demand of New Zealanders wishing to go overseas, and so I think Sri Lanka is a very good destination for New Zealanders. But part of the challenge there is just trying to remedy perceptions that were formed back in May, June, July, and bring people mentally up to where Sri Lanka has got to now, so that New Zealand can contribute to that sort of tourism revival.
I didn't hear sporting ties, so I mean, I know your
sporting ties. Yeah, I mean, I think the one thing that's striking to me, spending time in Sri Lanka, is how important rugby and the All Blacks are certainly to a group of Sri Lankans who go to schools who went to schools where rugby is played. We are quite keen to try to work out how we can bring more rugby expertise from New Zealand into Sri Lanka, whether that be via coaches or via exhibition games or whatever. We're still trying to work out what exactly that might be, but that's one area. And then you mentioned cricket. Obviously, it's a passion of mine, but it's also a passion of our two countries. And we've got the Sri Lankan men's team coming to New Zealand early next year, and we have the New Zealand women's team coming to Sri Lanka early next year as well. And we definitely want to make the most of that to build connections between our two countries.
Were you disappointed with New Zealand's performance at the World Cup?
Not really. I had very low expectations. T20 is definitely our worst format. Okay. And so I wasn't really, given we had Australia and England in our group, I wasn't expecting us to make the semi-finals. So when we did, I was pleasantly surprised. So I guess I was surprised pleasantly about our victory over Australia. That got us into the semi-finals. Yeah, the semi-final performance was disappointing. We left our worst performance to last, especially with the balls. That was very disappointing. But yeah, we do not have a T20 team that is in the same league really as England, Pakistan. I think that was the that was the correct final, and it was probably the correct winner. But I don't know. New Zealand played some good cricket in the tournament. Sri Lanka played some good cricket in the tournament. It was quite interesting that Sri Lanka had won the Asia Cup just prior. I think the change in conditions from this part of the world to Australia, really hurt the Sri Lankan team. But I do think the Sri Lankan team, certainly compared to when I arrived here 18 months ago, there's much more, and I think rightfully so, optimism about the Sri Lankan team. The performances the test performances against Australia and Pakistan during the during the height of the crisis, in fact, and the one-day performances against Australia, I think were very heartening. And I think there's a nucleus of a really good team there, and so hopefully that leads to some big success in the years ahead.
Right, so we'll have to leave it at that. Thank you so much for taking time and coming to our studios and having this chat with us, High Commissioner.
Thanks very much for your time.
And that's all the time we have for you for On Fire for this week. Till next time, stay safe.